title of this panel is From Combahee to Stonewall to Say Her Name and Beyond. And in a lot of ways, I feel like this panel is addressing, for those of you who were here for the previous panel, this panel is really about grappling with Sapphire's question, or Sapphire's second question.
Tina, can I just do one thing? If you're taking photos, will you please cut me out of photos? I don't like them, so you can take them of these wonderful people here. Thanks.
Please respect that request. Okay. So Sapphire was a 10th grader who came with her class, and she posed two amazing questions in the previous conversation. And the second question that Sapphire posed was, why does change take so long? From the mouth of a 10th grader. And I feel like in a lot of ways that's the ground on which we are walking. We are walking in the ground of why does change take so long, and we're very conscientious of that on this panel. What this panel is about is thinking about the connections between the past, the present, and the future. The past, the present, and our future, and the sustained work that we are doing to end police violence and criminalization against trans and gender nonconforming people of color, but also more broadly in terms of the project of abolition. So why have a panel like this? Beyond the obvious, I want to also state what it's not. And what this panel is not is about drawing a long, unending line of brutality, or a long, depressing line of what does it mean to be doing this work over the course of decades and centuries, even though that's what's been done, right? It's really about trying to think about what we can learn from the history of this struggle. It's about thinking intergenerationally about what strategies we can draw from both the continuities and the differences between then and now, and how to build a strategy based on the then and the now about tomorrow, about the future. So the way in which this discussion is organized is that it's really organized as a conversation among people who share a commitment, but very different histories and backgrounds and sites of struggle. And it's really about allowing us, or giving us the gift and the opportunity to benefit from your wisdom, from your strategies, from your tenacity, from your fierceness, and being able to take that forward into tomorrow, meaning tomorrow, Saturday, but also tomorrow beyond Saturday. And to really be able to start from the ground of this is not today's battle. It was yesterday's battle, and it's tomorrow's battle, and we're trying to actually figure out how it's not going to be the next generation's battle to wage. And I am joined by 4 phenomenal people physically and one extraordinary person virtually to help us have this conversation. So what I want to do is I want to first introduce them very briefly, but also giving them the respect that they are due. I was told, well, we'll just do some really brief introductions. I think we need more than really brief introductions, because this is a panel of people I revere, and I really want to actually say why I revere you. So the person sitting next to me is Barbara Smith. I guess you know who she is. Barbara Smith is one of the co-founders of the legendary Combahee River Collective and a co-author of their historic statement, the Combahee River Collective Statement, organized, for those of you who don't know, in support of Joan Little and in Boston around police failure to investigate disappearance and the disappearance and murder of Black women and girls. Barbara Smith is also the co-founder of Kitchen Table Women of Color Press in 1980, the first US publisher of books for women of color. Among her extraordinary list of accomplishments, she was, in 2005, elected to the Albany, New York Common Council and received the Stonewall Award for Service to the lesbian and gay community in 1994. By the by, she was also nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2005. Just saying. We are also joined by Kimberlé Crenshaw. Kim Crenshaw is professor of law at UCLA and Columbia Law School, and she is, as many of you know, a groundbreaking thinker on civil rights, Black feminist theory, critical race theory, and race, racism, and the law. She is a leading voice in calling for a gender-inclusive approach to racial justice interventions and founder of African American Policy Forum, #SayHerName, and co-author of Say Her Name, Resisting Police Violence Against Black Women. I'm gonna next introduce Robyn Maynard is a Canadian anti-police brutality and sex worker rights activist. She is also the author of the recently released Policing Black Lives, State Violence in Canada, From Slavery to the Present, which is also will be on sale after this event during the reception. Maynard is co-founder of Montreal Noir, a Black activist group committed to combating anti-Black racism in Quebec, and Justice for Victims of Police Killings, which work with families of victims of police killings to demand an end to police violence. At the end of our table is the extraordinary Mariame Kaba. Mariame is an organizer, educator, and curator whose work focuses on racial justice, gender justice, transformative and restorative justice, ending violence, dismantling the prison industrial complex, and supporting youth leadership development. In her spare time, she is the founder and director of Project Naya, a grassroots organization with a vision to end youth incarceration. She is the co-founder of Survived and Punished and a 2016-17 Soros Justice Fellow. Finally, joining us by video is Reina Gossett. Reina! Reina is an activist in residence here at the Barnard Center for Research on Women's Social Justice Institute. She's a filmmaker and expert on the history of Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, and trans women of color's resistance to state and interpersonal violence. She is a longtime activist around prison and police abolition. She's a lead researcher for A Fabulous Attitude, a participatory action project documenting the experiences of low-income and homeless LGBTQ folk in New York City. Come on. So the way this conversation is structured is that we're going to spend like 45 minutes to an hour really having a conversation in response to a series of questions. That series of questions I'm going to tell them to you as follows, right? Because this is not about sort of a kind of orderly conversation. It's about really listening and learning. And so there's really 4 questions. And they are about connecting the past, the present, and the future. The first of them is basically, how did you get activated in your organizing work around issues of police violence against Black women, trans and GNC people and women, and people of color? The second is, and this is asking our panelists to reflect on the relationship between then and now, or between history and the present. How has the conversation around police violence against Black women and women of color and trans and gender nonconforming people evolved over time? And what are the points of awareness and intervention you see as continuous throughout those conversations, or different and contemporarily salient? The fourth question is, why is it important to have this conversation right now? Right? And then the fourth question is the question that I think everybody's most interested in, which is, how do we move beyond this extraordinary moment of visibility, right, of awareness, into action, right? We're reflecting on how far we have come to get to this point where we have a really extraordinary intervention in now. We see it. It's there. It's public, and it's a conversation. How do we translate that into action? And throughout these questions, one of the things that I also want us to think about are the the specificities of what's happening here and on the other side of our borders, where Robyn is going to actually have a lot to contribute there in terms of thinking about these specificities of nation and place and communities, both in in different parts of North America. Okay? So, to begin with, unfortunately, Reina Gossett is not able to be here today, but she, as you know, just finished up a piece, a really important film piece. Many of you may or may not know that, but it's going to be premiering at the Whitney at the beginning of December. And she also just won an amazing award for her work on her most recent film project from HBO last night. And between that honorific and the ongoing work that she's doing, she could not make it tonight. But she's recorded a comment and a response that directly addresses these questions of how did she become activated, what brought her on this road, and where does she see us going forward, that I want to first play for us and then return to our commentators to actually talk about their own specific contributions. I've just gotten the signal that that's not going to happen. So while they try and figure out, I'm sorry, is that we'll come back to it. Which is, so we're going to start with the panel and then use the time to work out all the technology. So I would love to begin with Barbara in your response to any one of these questions, or all of them. So again, just to reiterate, it's about, I know, but I'm talking to Barbara Smith, which is to say, your pathway into this work. Mm-hmm. And then reflecting on that pathway in relationship to the current moment. And what do you think is important about having this conversation now?
Good evening, everyone. When Andrea, who I've known for some time, asked me to be a part of this conference, I said, why are you inviting me? Because of the fact that I do not focus on issues of police violence in my work. When I talked to her more recently, I had a general idea of why she was inviting me, but I just want to do full disclosure that that's not been a focus of my years of organizing and activism. But when we talked more recently, she reminded me, of course, as if I needed to have a reminder of the organizing that we did in Boston in 1979, when 12 black women were murdered within a 4-month period. They were not murdered by the police, but and they were not also murdered by a serial killer. Some of the murders were carried out by the same individuals, but these were a sequence of murders of black women that were not done by one perpetrator. And what Andrea pointed out to me is that one of the issues that we had is that the police department in Boston, which was a notorious police department during that time, a typical urban police department of the 1970s, that they did not take the murders seriously and were not doing full-fledged investigation. And I do remember going to demonstrations that we had organized in front of, I don't know if it was police headquarters, I believe it was, not just a station or whatever, or precinct. And I remember thinking, this is so dangerous, because we were literally out in front of police headquarters in a place called Boston, which had been going through a race war around the desegregation of the Boston public schools. And I remember thinking, and I was thinking about South Africa, I was thinking about Sharpeville and Soweto, I was thinking about things that can happen when you get that close to where all the guns are and where all the people with the guns are. So it's not exactly a footnote, but the thing is that Andrea thinks that that's a part of this discussion. See, I'm attributing everything to her. Why have I been motivated to do the kind of work that I've done? Well, just to try to summarize, and this is also something I was asked to try to do, what is the contribution of the Combahee River Collective's work, particularly the concept of interlocking oppressions? How does it connect to the ongoing reality of extrajudicial killings of black women, other women of color, trans women, and also men of color too? How do an understanding of interlocking oppressions get us to understand what's going on with that? As we know, in general, women are considered to be dispensable and have lives of little or no value. We are here, and I say this as a cisgendered lesbian, we are here at the disposal, supposedly at the disposal of men like Harvey Weinstein, who think that that's what we were put on earth for. Just like a yacht or a nice fancy car, that's why women are here on earth, to serve. Some of us never believed that, but because women are not considered to be valuable, because race and racism and white supremacy compound that, and because capitalism also doesn't care about anybody, and then you add homophobia, and transphobia, et cetera, you begin to see a mix. All of the communities, all of the identities that I have are all identities that separately are targeted by the police. Black people are targeted by the police. Women are vulnerable to the police misuse and abuse, and so are queer people, transgender people, etc. So, and poor people. So, as I said, if you have that understanding, then it's not a surprise that a system that whose reason for being is to exploit and to use and to throw away and discard, that it would also be very violent, because of course you cannot maintain a situation of oppression and exploitation without enforcing it with violence.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, I'm really just very grateful for this opportunity to have just another chance to sit beside the OG of Black feminism. Barbara Smith. Partly because of this work, I had the opportunity to reach out to Barbara. Can I even say that? Barbara.
But you did. It's true.
Well, but I did ask you.
It's true.
And I, sat looking at the phone for like 5 minutes before I could actually pick up the phone and dial her up and ask her, if I could talk to her about some of this work. So thank you, Andrea, for this opportunity. Thank you, Tina. This is just amazing. When I think about the how I came to this work, it's another step of the work that I started to do in '89, trying to understand how the law erased the various ways that Black women experienced disempowerment. And that led to demarginalizing the intersections of race and gender. And I was particularly concerned not only about the way law itself assumed that if the experience didn't happen to Black men and if it didn't happen to white women, it was irrelevant as far as the law was concerned. And the fact that our social justice discourses simply replicated that was the secondary problem that I was thinking about. So it was both the interlocking dimension and the way that the law allowed that interlocking to happen without any intervention whatsoever. So the next stage of that was thinking about violence against women of color, and again, the way that the main narrative in anti-racism around sex was a narrative around how African American men were disproportionately burdened by the state and not the way that African American women were disproportionately ignored by the state. And so all these were things that I was thinking about and working with activists, and then something just life-changing happened. Someone I knew was suddenly on television accusing a nominee to the Supreme Court of sexual harassment. So in support of Anita Hill, I went to Washington, spent some grueling time, not just dealing with the Senate Judiciary Committee, but dealing with African American people on the question of the erasure of the vulnerabilities of African American women to all sorts of violence, including intimate partner violence, sexual violence done both by people within our community and outside of our community. And one of the most devastating things to come out of that, number one, was the recognition that the vulnerabilities of the historic vulnerabilities, particularly of Black women to sexual violence, was not seen as part of anti-racist agenda. So many people who opposed Anita Hill opposed her by saying, complaining about this kind of thing is a white woman's thing. It's not something, that Black women traditionally complain about. Well, that was just a tremendous ignorance about the way that Black women's fight against sexual violence has been part of anti-racism from the very beginning. So that moment of recognition that we were actually in a position to harm ourselves, which we did. It was largely because of the overwhelming support that Clarence Thomas was able to garner from the Black community after Anita Hill came forward that put him on the Supreme Court. So now everything that happens as a 5-4 decision, including gutting Voting Rights Act, including campaign finance reform, I directly tie Trump in the White House today to failures within our own community to deal with our own history of patriarchy. So I came to this specific work having had a sense that fighting against the erasure of violence in our own communities across gender is one of the most important things we can do. And it appeared to come up on the agenda again when our former president, in response to Trayvon Martin, not in response to Renisha McBride, talked about the vulnerability of youth of color. So out of that, many of us started having town halls about the vulnerabilities that are not known, the vulnerabilities of cis and trans women, the vulnerabilities of straight and queer women, disabled women, undocumented women, all of these vulnerabilities not being part of the way we imagine what holds our community together. And if we can't talk about these things, then of course we can't move against them. And so within that context of conversation, many of the people who were testifying about losing loved ones to police violence. And that was a clear vulnerability that was not being talked about from the top, and in some ways was not really fully being foregrounded from the bottom up. So Say Her Name quite directly came out of moments when many of us in this room were marching in the aftermath of the Eric Garner no bill. We went to that march with pictures of Black women who were killed by the police. And the reaction of many of our co-marchers made it clear that there needed to be an intervention. Some people would look at it and just give us a thumbs up. Other people would look at it and they were incredulous. It's like, how is it that women are killed? It was just sort of outside of their realm of thought. And then there was a group that was angry about the fact that we were talking about someone other than cisgender African-American men in this moment. And what it convinced us of is that the need to actually become visible is the first step in actually creating a momentum to fight against the consequences. So Say Her Name was directly a response to the fact that people didn't want to say their names. It was a direct response that they didn't know the names to say. And direct response to the sense that not knowing the names isn't necessarily that important because the issue really isn't about them. So that's how I came into the work. That's much of what continues to motivate the work. And I'll just end with this last bit. You asked, well, where do I see it now? I think that what I've noticed now is that at least people, and when they do the whole list of names, they'll say one. One. Yeah. Usually it's Sandra Bland. Usually. But that's pretty much it with respect to the masses. So the question that I raise is, we can say Her Name. What do we need to do to create more traction about saying more than one name, or actually saying, okay, saying the name is just the ground floor. What we now have to do is figure out how to rethink the demands that we make so they are far more inclusive.
First of all, I really want to say thank you so much to Andrea for inviting me to be on this panel, and of really so many heroes of mine. It's really an honor. I know this is an intergenerational panel, but really so much of my own understandings of how I even came to be involved in any form of activism was really stemmed from the work that's been really done in many ways around this table. So I just really need to say a thank you before I begin. So I do my writing and I do my organizing based in Montreal in Canada. So many of you perhaps know about Canada as the end of the Underground Railroad, as the land of benevolence, of the land of multiculturalism, where we celebrate racial diversity, where racism, and particularly anti-Black racism, has no history. And that's something that is taught to us as people that grew up in Canada. So something that we really come up against is really the issue of how do we fight something as Black people in general, not even getting to the issue of Black women. How do we fight something that is broadly conceived of as not existing at all? From elementary school really throughout high school, the way the Canadian lens of understanding racism is fundamentally through looking at racism in the United States. We're taught about slavery, about the responses to slavery, about Rosa Parks, but the reality that slavery was practiced in Canada for 200 years is not mentioned at all. I've actually had the great privilege of getting to do many book launches. I've probably talked to 800 or 900 people over the last few months, and every person that I've asked in the room who has actually learned about the history of Canadian slavery in any level of schooling, including university, and there's not one hand raised. So we're very much contending with a long-standing erasure of our own, of a very unique Canadian history, and understanding racism as something that only exists in the United States. So that really makes for a kind of harm that I think is done to our communities that experience, that are 10 times more likely to be killed by the police, that are represented in prisons at a rate of 3 times the rate in our populations, including Black women. But this invisibility of that, even the existence of anti-Blackness, is something that's extremely damaging. So this is why I really think about something about consciousness raising and the work that has been done, for example, by Barbara Smith and Kimberlé as a gift to us to really be able to understand the condition that we are in, because it's really that allows us to contest it, and that's something that's been very difficult in Canada. So I was actually speaking with Andrea recently, and she was telling me that Policing Black Lives, I think you'd use the word a secret feminist text, because given the longstanding erasure of the history of anti-Black racism, of the history of 200 years of slavery, segregated schooling, really the last school in Canada, segregated school, closed in 1983, actually, in Canada, in the East Coast. So really trying to tell this story for me, in what many ways was sort of the first time in a chronological way in the Canadian context, was to absolutely refuse to recreate the forms of ways of understanding policing and the ways of understanding racist violence that only allowed men within that view. So what does it mean to actually, instead of adding women as an add-on into this larger history of finally tracing this long legacy of enslavement and its long legacy into the present day, to make that already intersectional, to make that already looking at both the violences that have been enacted on Black men and on Black women as fundamental to the evolution of policing? And that was something that I was really working and engaging with as I was trying to put together this text. How can I make it so that, yes, the issue of what we call carding in Canada, but what you call stop and frisk here, is fundamentally an issue of racial profiling, of racial violence, but the treatment of, for example, Black sex workers that I spent years witnessing as a street-based outreach worker, that the treatment of Black women in their homes by social workers, the surveillance that they experience by immigration agents when they do not have their citizenship, that these are also forms of racial profiling and violence and of policing that are just as intrinsic, really, to the way that we need to understand this work. So that was really what was at the heart of trying to bring out this text that I was trying to sort of give as a gift to my past self, that because of, I think, really that what you're going through when you're experiencing racism, but literally do not have a lens from a national perspective, and especially as a Black woman, do not have sort of any lens to make legible your experiences. So what I guess, really, it was just sort of an excavation exercise in many ways. Yeah.
So first, really want to thank Andrea, Tina, and the center for pulling this together, for giving me an opportunity to be on a panel with a lot of my touchstones in terms of my work and my thinking, which has helped to inform my organizing over these years. I was thinking, when I heard that Barbara Smith was going to be on the panel, that one of the first examples of a defense campaign that you all were involved in Boston, beyond Joan Little, was also the case of a woman named Ella Mae Ellison, which was a wrongful conviction case that Combahee and people in Boston organized around to basically free a woman who had been wrongfully convicted on a first-degree murder charge and a conspiracy armed robbery charge. We learned something about how to do campaigns around freeing women who were criminalized by the state wrongly from that experience. I have a lot of gratitude to all of you for that work and for kind of, paving the way forward for the rest of us to learn and be able to keep pushing. So thank you for that. Of course, Kim, in your work, just always informing us to really be centered in the idea of the burdens that are placed on people based on your social location, creating new suffering, and that's been something that's been important. And I went to college in Montreal, and Robyn's from Montreal. I do know that slavery existed in Canada. They taught us that much at McGill. So I'm really grateful for her work and your focus on Canada and bringing in the anti-Blackness history of that. So that also informs me. I came to do this work. I was thinking about it the other day. I went to my first anti-police brutality demonstration when I was 14 years old here in New York City. So I've been doing work for a long time around these issues, even before I understood that I was doing work around these issues, right? And I've engaged in multiple contexts. And one of when I was growing up, I grew up in New York City. Eleanor Bumpers was killed when I was 13 years old, and the person who killed her was acquitted when I was 15. I remember very clearly that she was killed. I remember that people were organizing against her killing. I don't remember organizing against it. Because I thought very much that the killing of Black men was that was what we were fighting to end. I didn't see myself so much as a woman or a girl. My gender didn't play in the way that my race did. I grew up in Black nationalist organizing. And that, it just was a different conversation. Like my own kind of survivorship and victimization didn't play so much in what it was that we were fighting to end. And it wasn't until later on, when I was older, that came into being, that I gained an understanding of myself as a gendered person, and that I claimed a woman as an identity for myself that would also be part of my organizing. So I think that's the case for many of us who started doing work around, anti-state violence work, particularly in the 1980s. That seemed to be the case for a lot of my peers, at least. So I wanted to say something about how I came into the work was mainly actually through doing political prisoner defense stuff, campaigns, and particularly the Move 9, and Ramona Africa, and all the women who were either killed or were imprisoned, some of whom are still in prison today, over basically a mass terroristic police attack against Black people in the United States. Something that does not get talked about as a form of police violence, but it's like the ultimate form of state violence. It's throwing a bomb on a bunch of people for whatever the reasons are that you actually do that, right? So that really was a radicalizing thing for me, and helped me to start to think about state violence in a way that was much broader than the way that people were talking about it, that involved including a whole bunch of new people and new harms that hadn't been the ones that we were focusing on, forcing me to widen my lens, to look at lethal force not as the only or even main form of violence that's being perpetrated against people on a daily level. If you add up the number of people killed versus the number of people sexually assaulted, harassed, harmed, wrongfully convicted, that list is so much longer than who got killed. Not to say that we shouldn't care about who gets killed. That's obviously a most spectacular form of violence. But really, when you're thinking about itemizing atrocities, you often think about the deaths over everything else. And that's a problem, because everything else is what's with us at the living, right? All the time. So I think a lot about the word accumulation. Because accumulation, right, as a definition of what that means, it means to gather and pile up, especially little by little. And that's what's happening with the killings. But accumulation it gives us kind of an enumeration of harm. But what we have is actually an excess of harm. And excess can't be measured. And so when that happens, I think that we're really kind of we're at a loss right now in our conversation, in part because our definitions are so wanting of what is actually happening. And so I was thinking about this the other day, that part of what happens when you define policing as actually an entire system of harassment, violence, and surveillance that keeps oppressive gender and racial hierarchies in place, when that's your definition of policing, then that means that what happens is that your whole entire frame shifts. And it also forces you to stop talking about it as though it's an issue of individuals. It forces you to focus on systemic structural issues that need to be addressed in order for this to happen. It also gives us space to consider other kinds of victims and other kinds of harms that are foreclosed when we use terms like police brutality and violence. This is not an issue of police brutality, and police violence is a misnomer. It's actually redundant, because policing is violence in and of itself. It is. So I just want to put out there that we're in deep trouble. And we're in deep trouble because we're not talking about the same things. And when you start talking about policing as a system that's actually about harassment, violence, and surveillance, then you're not gonna accept bullshit reform. You're gonna understand from the beginning that what we're talking about is the horizon of abolition. It's the only way. So I just wanna put that out there to start.
So
A
I
bunch of
want to.
people, riffraff, get them out of the room. Where is security?
So I'd like to bring Reina into the conversation. I have heard that she's ready to talk to us. So she's going to give her statement on what's brought her into this work, and then I want to return and ask a sort of follow-up question, wrap-up question.
Hi, this is Reina, and I am recording this because I unfortunately am not able to attend what will, I'm sure, to be a beautiful and brilliant conference. The Invisible No More Conference is such an urgent and necessary space to engage, and I feel such loss about not being able to attend tonight. Not only because some of the most brilliant activists, organizers, theorists, movers and shakers all around are on this panel and are going to be present during the weekend, but also because the Invisible No More Conference is doing something that I believe is so necessary, which is creating space for those of us who are most vulnerable to state and police violence, not that those two can ever be separated, to come together and study. And when I say study, I don't mean something formal, like with textbooks and what happens in classrooms necessarily. I say study in a way that means we come together, all of us, and really start to speculate, to break down and make meaning out of our condition, what is shaping the violences that we're navigating and resisting, and also spotlight and dream up and imagine what we're already doing together so beautifully and powerfully in order to resist and create more room for those of us to live, all of us to live. So I'm really sad to miss that part of the conference. That to me is going to be one of the most meaningful ways of this weekend. So earlier today I was thinking about the conference because I was walking by the Women's House of Detention Center's former site in the West Village. So the Women's House of Detention Center was a jail that no longer exists, that many people who were alive, living, working, sleeping in the West Village, who were Black, who were people of color, who were low income or disabled, who were sex workers, were often incarcerated at. During the first anniversary of Gay Pride, Pride being the event that celebrates 1969 Christopher Street liberation, the day that many of our elders and ancestors fought back against the New York Police Department's policing of our expression, of our beauty, those of us who are trans and gender nonconforming. And our ancestors and elders, people like Miss Major and Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, Bambi Lamore and Dora Marks fought back. And it wasn't a kind of fighting back that hadn't happened before. We know that this is a kind of resistance that so many of our ancestors and elders repeated all of the time. But in 1969, in June, in New York City, downtown, this was a night that gets commemorated every year in Pride. The first Pride, though, happened outside of the Women's House of Detention Centers, because the organizers of Pride wanted to draw a really clear connection between the incarceration of people who were being held at the Women's House of Detention Center, including members of the Black Panther Party, such as Afeni Shakur and Joan Bird, and the ongoing daily forms of police violence that gender nonconforming, trans people, people of color, people doing sex work were navigating and facing every day. And so the organizers made a rally outside of the Women's House of Detention Center, and the cry was, "Free our sisters, free ourselves." And to me, that is so meaningful and important to bring in the room those always already ongoing connections between multiple forms of state and police violence that move through and shape many communities. that work that was so visible and present at the first anniversary of Pride, Christopher Street Liberation, continues today. And one of the ways that I was really touched by it was when I was part of Queers for Economic Justice. I was the director of the Welfare Project, and at the time we had a group called the Welfare Warriors. And what we were doing was gathering regularly to examine, to study, to dream up our responses to police violence, especially as it happened in agencies and organizations where we needed to access benefits in order to survive. For instance, those of us who were low income and disabled accessing benefits from the Social Security Administration or from the Human Resources Administration, which oversees welfare in New York City. So many of us experienced a kind of gendered, ableist, anti-Black, transphobic, homophobic violence whenever we went in and needed the very small benefits that they were giving out. And that, for so many of us, really threatened our survival, right? At a time when transphobic, anti-Black, ableist, gendered violence, really creates so many obstacles for us to have things like jobs and have an income. Things like welfare and social security disability benefits are actually a necessary, vital need for us. So we in the Welfare Warriors started to study and speculate. We asked our friends about what was going on. We made a movie. We made a really wonderful resource report called A Fabulous Attitude, where we were asking the questions of ourselves and our own community about what were the problems and what were the ways that we resisted those problems. And I want to read a little bit from the Fabulous Attitude, and you can find it online. Unfortunately, Queers for Economic Justice doesn't exist anymore, but A Fabulous Attitude continues to live on and have a huge and important afterlife. So from the manifesto, we have, "We are not victims," Welfare Warriors members wrote. "We have found and created many acts of daily resilience and resistance. We argue, complain, file reports, write letters, document hearings, file for fair hearings, sue, call 311, call the police, call people in charge, call the media, scream, intervene in physical situations, fight back with organizations, fight back with friends, do research, sign petitions, force the issues, go to protests, lobby representatives, go to jail, advocate for policies, advocate for ourselves, engage in community education, work street patrols, maintain spirituality, keep trying." And I wanted to bring that into the room, especially tonight when we are thinking about police violence and state violence, to really emphasize those what might be called seemingly small acts of resistance and refusal that are actually deeply meaningful. At the 2015 Insight conference that many of us probably in this room attended, Miss Major talked to me about those small personal ways that she chose to do exactly what many of us in the Welfare Warriors were doing, which is fight back. Ways that everyday people can fight back, people who those who were at the Stonewall riots, like Sylvia and Dora, Bambi and Marcia, people who were part of Queers for Economic Justice Welfare Warriors and going into the Human Resources Administration, and people like Miss Major. So one of the stories, the last story that I want to share, is this moment where Miss Major changed all of her ID back to male. She is a Black trans elder, one of the people who is still alive and fought back at Stonewall, and she was telling me this story that I think is really important to bring in the room around police violence, where she, just like everybody else at the time, changed her identification, like her driver's license, to female, right? The gender ID operates on a gender binary that is so enforced and regulates so many of our lives. So she didn't want to be in the bathroom and get harassed and face arrest. So as a trans person, as a trans woman, so she changed all of her ID to female. And then it dawned on her one day that, she told me, she's like, "Wait a minute, I don't feel female. I'm a transgender person and I want people to love me for that. So I changed all my ID back to male." And that was my way of striking back, she told me. And you have to find your own. So I want to close with that. and really bring into the room that those small, personal, urgent ways of fighting back that might not look, big and large and important to people with kind of formal positions of power, but that our community is doing every day is so vital and necessary and such an important part of this conference, and has, really shaped the conference, and something that I'm really excited to hear about afterwards. So again, I'm so sorry I'm not able to be there tonight, but I'm looking forward to hearing about how it goes, and I'm thankful for all of the time and labor that went into making this conference happen, and allowing for me to be here tonight through video. Thank you.
So I want to pose a final question and ask for some brief responses from our panel, our roundtable, mostly because Barbara has to get a car.
To get to a train.
To get to a train.
Yeah.
A car to a train to get back. And it's really taking up what Reina's put into the room, which is combining the two questions that I asked secondly, which is, why have this conversation right now? What's important about that? And what's important about having this conversation right now is moving from the conversation, moving from the visibility of the issues that so many of the activists in this room have brought to light, and transforming that into action. So it's a big question that I want to ask you to reflect on briefly, which is to say, having this conversation right now, how do you see us moving from talking to doing to working? What would you suggest, what would your suggestion be to the people in this room who are all here because they want to make that transition from conversation to activism? What would you offer as the point of transition?
That's a hard question for me to answer because of the fact that I have always been politically active to this day, so I don't know how you not do that. No, I really don't, because I don't like oppression, and I don't like being subordinate and defined as inferior. I don't know what it is about those things that just kind of bother me, but I've never, I cannot tolerate a world in which people are being hurt and abused. That's a world we live in. Perhaps it's a world we've always lived in, but there are always people who step out and take risk to say, no more, it's not happening anymore. The best parts of human history are the points at which people have stood up to vested interest power, to injustice, to violence, and have said, no, it's not going to go this way, even if it means that we have to sacrifice our own lives. So, as I said, I don't really know how to talk about making the transition from talking about it to doing something about it, because I've never been in the just talking about it stage. Mariame, I loved when she was talking about things that were important to her about my contributions, my hoped for contributions. She talked about Ella Ellison. The campaign was Free Ella Ellison. And I can see the poster, and I can see her face, photographs of her face in my mind's eye as you were saying that. Combahee, there are a couple of things that distinguish Combahee, but the two that I want to mention right through here is practice. It was not just theory. Our theory was absolutely informed by our practice. At the very same time that we were writing about interlocking oppressions, we were going out to support construction workers, third world construction workers who were being shut out of jobs on new construction projects in the city of Boston. And boy, were they surprised to see us. But to see us, that was our level of solidarity. We always had practice wedded to our theory. And then the other thing is that we were anti-capitalist. We were socialist. And that meant that we weren't like looking for Band-Aids or window dressing or like minor fixes or, we understood that we were in a systematic trick bag of oppression that the only solution really was a revolutionary solution. So, as I said, I don't really know how to make the transition from thought to action. Now, having said that, we were always thinking, always, we were very, very thoughtful people. We were very, very insightful people. So it's not like we were willy-nilly just, running out there and doing the first thing that came to mind. We were very, very strategic. I'm involved in being very strategic to this day. But you've got to make that transition, and you also need to know that it doesn't have to be in a huge organization. I've never been a part of huge organizations. I've always been a part of small, generally community-based grassroots groups, not staffed, that work in a local context on issues of national and international significance. So those are my suggestions. And can I do a shameless plug or two? The Poor People's Campaign. I was just at the conference in Binghamton a couple of weeks ago. The Poor People's Campaign is coming to a state near you. Keep your eyes and ears open. There will be announcements soon, and there will be weeks of civil disobedience coming in the spring. So keep your eyes and ears open. And then also, other shameless plug is a book about the Combahee River Collective that includes interviews with the 3 co-authors, edited by Kianga Yamada Taylor, How We Get Free, Black Feminism in the Combahee River Collective. That's coming out in a few weeks. So I'm done. And I will have to depart now. I'll be listening, though, as I...
Well, after that, I'll just be very brief. I actually think that when we're in a moment where we're sliding in a direction where fascism is not a term that cannot be used, that what counts as resistance actually shifts. At this moment, refusing to die is resistance. Refusing to let this be normal is resistance. Refusing to look away and refusing to blame ourselves is resistance. So this is a moment where I think the consequences of some of the struggles that we've had internal to communities, liberal communities, progressive communities, communities of color, queer communities, some of those failed moments of solidarity have come at this moment to be the condition of this possibility. And the question that we have to deal with is how can we fight against what's happening, against predation. We've got a predator in chief in the White House right now, and a band of merry men who are also, and a few women, who are also contributing to predation. And at the same time, we have those who have set the terms of these debates in ways that taken the words out of our mouths, the ability to actually name what has happened. Much of what we're dealing with was in place long before Trump showed up.
Absolutely.
How do we talk about both of those things at the same time? That is the challenge, right? The challenge of talking about a neoliberal regime and now a neo-fascist regime. What are the commonalities in both of those, and what are the things that we have to challenge in order to be able to talk about that? One of the things we have to challenge is the idea that we cannot engage in intense critical dialogue with people who look like us. People who share our identities, people who share our very communities. There are ways in which we sometimes have a hard time actually calling out the politics of death, even if they look like, you know, they're coming from people who look like us. So I think now we're at the point where we realize we can't afford this kind of politics anymore. Which is not to say that identity should not be part of politics. Identity should not be part of allowing a certain negative agenda to go unmarked simply because it comes from someone that we might have voted for. someone who we like, someone who looks pretty good. We've got to be able to call it out.
You gotta say the
And so
truth.
that's how I'm
Talk
living
about
right
it.
now.
Talk about it.
So for myself, really coming again from really where I am, which is having just articulated this like large text on what policing anti-blackness in Canada, I think it's important for me to say that very much I'm not interested in creating a black Canadian nationalism. We need to remember that nation states are inherently a colonial imposition. If you even look at the history of sort of the way that passports have come to these lands is very much the descriptions in the Book of Negroes of the enslaved people that were brought to Canada that ended up facing extremely difficult conditions, many of whom actually left again afterwards. So this border between what we call Canada and the United States is something that's really been imposed on Turtle Island onto Indigenous communities that were previously there. I don't think that we as black displaced formerly enslaved people need to abide by those colonial borders. Thank you. Many ways that in Canada, black people have been forced to be silent, and the ways that our struggles have been erased is by creating this national narrative in which the United States is the place in which racism exists. We often look at, for example, the freeing of 3,000 black loyalists when it was a British colony in the 19th century, but at the same time, white loyalists actually brought 1,200 black slaves into Canada. So many of these moments that we look upon as how we sort of separate these two countries and their differing legacies of racial violence are actually far more similar than I think many of us think. We're in a moment indeed now when I think that the thousands of Haitian migrants that have crossed from the United States into the Canadian border, where you're seeing all these headlines of Canada as being, again, the new underground railroad. But we need to remember that Canada actually already lifted the deportation moratorium on Haiti before Trump has threatened to. We need to remember, if we're going to be talking about gender violence, that Mavis Otete was actually a Ghanaian woman, a 57-year-old woman who, trying to cross the border from the United States into Canada, actually froze to death and died this winter. And the reason that people are crossing the border in such dangerous ways is because Canada actually refuses to rescind the safe third country policy that would actually mean that people would not have to cross the border in such dangerous ways. So we cannot allow this Underground Railroad myth to be resurrected again as a distraction that really disguises us from the cross-border kinds of racial violence that are being inflicted on black communities on both sides of the border. And if we look to many of the times of sort of greatest strengths in terms of resistance as well, we can see that there's been something that has really existed across Turtle Island. For example, during the era of the Underground Railroad, black enslaved people in Chatham, Ontario, alongside free black Canadian people, were actually working to fight off slave catchers who were crossing the border and trying to forcibly bring black people back to the United States and be enslaved. And not only were they facing the possible violence from slave catchers, but many of them actually faced arrest from the Canadian government. But again, this is a moment when, of course, that border that was not drawn about us or for us, is something that does not need to interrupt the kind of black struggle that we're going to need across this continent if we're really going to win. Thank you. I think we also just really need to remember, there are other moments as well. Stokely Carmichael, for example, came to Halifax in the 1960s and Montreal. There are so many different moments in which we look at the height of black power that have actually been not national moments, right, but actually global moments, because the transatlantic slave trade was a global violence. So if we get caught up comparing the different kinds of anti-black racism that exist in the United States versus Canada versus Brazil, for example, we're really doing a disservice to the ongoing realities of enslavement that are still living today. So I think that really now, when we're in this moment of what people are calling this sort of migration crisis, along with the crisis of white supremacy, when we're looking at, for example, all the black African migrants that are dying in the Mediterranean Sea and the massive displacement of black people that are being disproportionately affected by climate change, we really do need to look at anti-blackness again as a global struggle that we're all fighting, not within a national framework, but one that's not only intersectional, but is really cross borders in its scale and in its scope.
I'm thinking about three things. I'm thinking about the ways that the invisibility of the harms also invisibilizes the resistance to those harms. And that erasure doesn't just happen by people who have nefarious ideas about wanting to continue to hold power, but also by us. So that part of the way that we move forward is to make sure that we see again all of the resistances that are happening, that happened in the past and that are happening today. Because people are doing things. People are acting. People are trying to build power. In the moment we're in right now, the question is we need more people doing that work, and we need more of a way to kind of make that work move towards a goal that we can agree to without necessarily being unified. I'm against unity. So, yeah, basically, I just am. I think that there's like this complete fetishization of unity when unity itself means nothing. What we want is a transformation of the conditions that are immiserating people, I think. And if we can do that, then it doesn't fucking matter whether we're unified while we're doing it. So, like, there's too much time spent on that. So the other thing that I'm thinking about is that part of, I think, the analysis of the current moment is that we're chalking up a lot of the death and mistreatment to the cost of doing business in a democracy, whatever that means in terms of democracy. And that business really is to maintain control and power over the undesirables. Right. So we're kind of the casualties of a war that's deemed necessary by people of all sorts. People in power and people who are striving for more power, and also people who are aspiring to power. And those can be people of any race, of any identity, of any, right? So like, we've got to start to identify that and think about that. And that we're talking about people as collateral damage, right, in this war. So our deaths and injuries are serving this kind of larger maintenance of capitalism and white supremacy. And perhaps this analysis that I'm offering makes it more understandable why we're where we are right now. Because the people who mourn collateral damage really are few. The people who mourn collateral damage or the people who are murdered and injured, are the people who love them. That's a very specific slice of people. And then the people who are basically defining themselves as anti-war, which explains why we are very few. Because most people are not actually anti-war, and most people only, if you only care about people you love, that's a small universe. So the issue that we have is to broaden who cares about people, and that means transforming ourselves in some way from collateral damage into something else that's human, and that has a reason for why people then should care, right? And I don't mean that we have to then supplicate ourselves and make ourselves human to our oppressors. It's that I think sometimes we just have to make ourselves human to ourselves and to each other. And that's really hard. And so I don't really know how to solve that puzzle, but I think it's a puzzle that needs solving. And then the last thing I want to say is I want to share this piece from Rebecca Farr, who used to work with communities against rape and abuse, particularly in this moment as we're thinking about kind of, sexual violence is a lot in the media, it's in the news, and people are talking about that. And somehow I'm very concerned because the response to that seems to be a carceral response that's desired by some people, which I understand why, because kill the rapist, right? Like that seems to be like the thing, and there's t-shirts about that and all, but I worry that what we're thinking about is we think this is a problem of punishment when it's actually a problem of political organizing. So it really is, you gotta shift your mindset away from a problem of punishment to a problem of organizing. And that shifts the landscape of what's possible, in real ways. And so Rebecca Farr writes this. She says, "I'm not proposing that sexual violence and domestic violence will no longer exist. I'm proposing that we create a world where so many people are walking around with the skills and knowledge to support someone that there is no longer a need for anonymous hotlines. I am proposing that we break through the shame of survivors as a result of rape culture and the victim-blaming ideology of all of us as a result of rape culture, so that survivors can gain support from the people already in their lives. I am proposing that we create a society where community members care enough to hold an abuser accountable so that a survivor does not have to flee their home. I am proposing that all of the folks that have been disappointed by systems work together to create an alternative system. I'm proposing that we organize. And I think that is the same answer for the question around policing. It's that if there is an opportunity for us to work together to create the supports necessary to hold each other, if in 25 years you dial 911 or 311 and the first person that it calls is your neighbor, if we're at that stage, right, that changes everything. And that everything has to change for that to be possible, right? Like abolition is both about dismantling but also about building. It is also about that kind of like, what are we dismantling? Like not just institutions, we're also the dismantling mindsets and the punishment mindset that is so prevalent for all of us and holds such power and makes it almost impossible for you to like take the ceiling off your brain to imagine a different world. That if you can't do that, then obviously nothing we're talking about today is possible. But I believe we can. I believe people are. And so let's go do it, basically.
Join me in thanking our amazing panelists.